What if I told you that the enemy you've been fighting isn't an enemy at all? That every self-help book, every guru telling you to destroy your ego, might just be leading you into a deeper trap. You've been lied to. The ego isn't a monster lurking in your mind. It's not the villain stopping you from becoming your highest self. In fact, your ego might just be the key to everything you've been looking for. Power, purpose, peace, but only if you stop trying to destroy it. Welcome to Forbidden Text, where we uncover hidden knowledge and forbidden wisdom. The ego, 3 simple letters that have been demonized, misunderstood, and blamed for every failure in your life. Ego is the enemy, they say. Get rid of it. But have you ever stopped to wonder, if the ego is part of who you are, what happens when you try to erase it? What if trying to destroy your ego is like trying to destroy your own reflection, leaving you fractured, directionless, and more lost than ever? Here's the uncomfortable truth. You've been at war with yourself. And the reason you can't win isn't because you're weak or flawed. It's because you've been fighting the wrong battle. The payoff. By the end of this, you'll know how to stop the internal war and finally use the ego, not against yourself, but for yourself. But first, let's get real. What is the ego? Forget the overcomplicated psychology jargon. Your ego is your sense of I. It's the voice in your head that says, "This is who I am." It's the part of you that protects you, defines you, drives you. The ego built your boundaries. It kept you alive when life got hard. It pushed you to stand up for yourself when no one else would. And yet, somewhere along the way, we started calling it the bad guy. Why? Because an unchecked ego could destroy you, but only if you let it. Stick around, because by the end of this journey, you're going to learn why the ego isn't your enemy, how to stop letting it control you, and most importantly, how to make it work for you. It's time to rewire everything you thought you knew about yourself. Let's dive in. The world loves extremes, doesn't it? Destroy your ego. Crush it. Bury it 6 feet deep. That's the message you've been sold. But here's the thing. Every time you try to destroy your ego, you're just fighting yourself. You're hacking away at the very part of you that has kept you alive, that has shaped your identity, that has given you the drive to survive. Think about it. What happens when you cut off the thing that fuels your ambition? Your self-worth, your confidence. You don't become enlightened. You become hollow. Now, don't get me wrong. The ego unchecked can wreak havoc. It's the part of you that craves validation, that whispers you're better than everyone else, that lashes out when you feel threatened. But here's the kicker. The problem isn't the ego itself. The problem is when you let it drive the car while you sit in the backseat. You've been told to destroy the ego, but that's not the solution. The solution is to take the wheel. The ego isn't something to destroy. It's something to train. Like fire, it can burn you, or it can keep you warm. Like a sword, it can wound, or it can protect. It's not the tool that's dangerous, it's how you wield it. The truth is, your ego has been trying to help you all along. It's been shouting for attention, begging you to notice it. And instead of listening, you've been trying to silence it. But what if, instead of silencing it, you could harness it? What if you could turn that inner voice into a powerful ally? The world doesn't need less ego. It needs better ego. Ego that's aligned with your purpose. Ego that doesn't crave the spotlight but fuels your confidence. Ego that doesn't seek to dominate but seeks to elevate. This isn't about inflating your ego, it's about transforming it. Here's a wild thought. The ego isn't a fixed thing. It's malleable. It adapts, evolves, changes, if you let it. Most people don't. Most people either let their ego run wild or try to crush it completely. Both paths lead to the same place, misery. But there's a third path, a middle way. A way to make peace with the ego and use it as the engine of your growth. And that's where the story gets interesting. You see, the ego isn't some abstract concept. It's a living, breathing part of you. It's the part that says, I can. It's the part that dreams big, that takes risks, that steps up when it matters. But it's also the part that feels fear, that builds walls, that protects you from pain. The ego isn't good or bad. It just is. The question is, what will you do with it? Most people spend their entire lives at war with their own minds. They either feed their ego until it consumes them, or they starve it until they lose their sense of self. Neither path leads to freedom. True freedom comes from integration, when you stop treating your ego like the enemy and start treating it like the partner it was meant to be. And that's the journey we're on today. By the end of this, you're going to understand why your ego isn't something to fear. You're going to see how it can become your greatest asset. And most importantly, you're going to learn how to take back control, not by fighting your ego, but by working with it. Because here's the ultimate truth. The ego isn't your enemy. It's a mirror. And when you finally learn to see it for what it is, you stop fighting yourself and start becoming yourself. But before we get there, let me ask you this. Who are you without your ego? Can you even answer that question? Or has the constant battle left you disconnected from the real you? Stick around, because we're about to go deeper. Everything you thought you knew about yourself, it's time to shatter it. Here's the paradox. Everyone tells you to let go of your ego, to detach from it, but the moment you try, you're still being led by it. That's because the ego doesn't go quietly. It's not designed to disappear, it's designed to survive. And that's its genius. It's the part of you that screams, I matter. The part that refuses to back down, no matter how many times life knocks you to the ground. Without it, you'd crumble under the weight of failure, rejection, and doubt. Think about it. Who gets back up when you're beaten down? Who refuses to let the world define you? That's not your ego holding you back. That's your ego stepping in, reminding you that you're here for something bigger, that you're worth fighting for. So, why is it demonized? Because left unchecked, it's like a flood. Chaotic, destructive, uncontrollable. But a flood isn't inherently evil. It's just water in the wrong place. The ego's the same. It only becomes toxic when you let it run wild, when you let it define your worth based on what other people think, or when it convinces you that you're invincible. Here's the raw truth. The ego's job isn't to destroy you or glorify you. Its job is to protect you. But when you don't understand it, when you ignore it, fight it, or try to destroy it, it overcompensates. It becomes a distorted version of itself, desperate to be seen, heard, validated. That's when the ego becomes a problem. But here's the twist. The solution isn't to suppress it. The solution is to understand it. To see it for what it is, a tool, not a tyrant. The ego isn't out to ruin you. It just wants you to pay attention. And when you do, that's when everything changes. Imagine this. Instead of battling your ego, you begin to work with it. You recognize its voice, but you don't let it dictate your life. You feel its fear, but you don't let it stop you. You use its power, but you don't let it control you. This isn't about ego death. It's about ego mastery. But here's the challenge. Mastering the ego requires a level of self-awareness most people aren't willing to face. It means looking at the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. The pride, the insecurity, the need for validation. It means admitting that your ego isn't the enemy. It's a reflection of your deepest fears and desires. And that's why so many people choose the easy path. They either inflate their ego, hiding behind arrogance and false confidence, or they suppress it, pretending they're above it all. But both paths lead to the same place, disconnection. From yourself, from others, from reality. The real path, it's messy. It's uncomfortable. But it's the only way to true freedom. Because when you stop seeing your ego as the enemy, you realize it's been trying to help you all along. It's the scared, wounded part of you that's just trying to protect what it thinks you need. It's the voice that says, don't risk it. Don't fail. don't get hurt. But instead of silencing that voice, what if you could understand it? What if you could listen without letting it take over? That's the secret. The ego doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be heard, acknowledged, integrated. And when you do that, that's when the real you starts to emerge. So, here's the question. Are you ready to stop fighting yourself? Are you ready to stop running from the parts of you that make you uncomfortable? Because the moment you do, the moment you stop trying to destroy your ego and start working with it, is the moment you take your power back. And isn't that what you've been searching for all along? This journey isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be. Not in spite of your ego, but because of it. Let's keep going. You're closer than you think. Beneath all the noise, beneath all the layers of pride, fear, and self-preservation, there's something deeper, something more real. And it's not about destroying the ego to find it. It's about seeing the ego for what it is, a tool, not your identity. The people who preach ego death as the ultimate goal often miss the point. True freedom doesn't come from annihilation. It comes from integration. It comes from looking your ego in the eye and saying, I see you. I understand you, but you don't control me. Here's what no one tells you. Your ego isn't the source of your suffering. It's your resistance to the ego. The constant battle, the need to prove yourself, the fear of failure. All of it stems from the war you're waging within. And the only way to end that war is to make peace. Not surrender. Not domination. Peace. So, how do you do it? How do you turn the ego from an enemy into an ally? It starts with awareness. Catch yourself in the act. When the ego flares up, when it screams for attention, when it whispers that you're not good enough or shouts that you're better than everyone else. Don't fight it. Don't judge it. Just notice it. Like a spotlight on a stage, your attention alone has the power to calm the storm. The next step, compassion. Your ego is like a scared child. It lashes out not because it's cruel, but because it's afraid. Afraid of being unseen. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of being unworthy. Instead of shutting it down, ask yourself, what is my ego trying to protect? The answer might surprise you. And finally, take back the wheel. Your ego will always have something to say. That's its job. But it doesn't have to steer your life. You do. When the ego tells you to prove your worth, remind yourself that you're already enough. When it tells you to hide your flaws, remind yourself that your imperfections are what make you human. When it tells you to cling to control, remind yourself that letting go is where real power lies. Here's the payoff. When you stop treating your ego as the enemy, it stops fighting you. When you embrace it as part of who you are, flaws and all, you start to see the bigger picture. You're not just the ego. You're not just the mind or the body or the stories you tell yourself. You're the awareness behind it all. And that awareness, that's where your freedom lives. So, let me ask you again, who are you without your ego? The answer isn't what you expected, is it? Because you're not here to destroy the ego. You're here to master it, to see it, to hear it, to understand it, but not to be ruled by it. In the end, being real isn't about ego death. It's about ego balance. It's about letting your ego serve you, not the other way around. It's about living with purpose, clarity, and humility, not because you've erased the ego, but because you've finally made peace with it. And when you do that, you stop fighting yourself. You stop running. And for the first time, you feel whole. This is the truth they don't want you to know. The ego isn't your enemy. It's a misunderstood ally. And when you learn to embrace it, to use it wisely, you unlock the life you've always been searching for. Now, it's your turn. The ego isn't going anywhere. But maybe that's the best news you've heard all day.